Respond to what was said by his honourable friend, that skunk, and that expression is only used in this country, and because there are different strengths of THC, skunk is a product of prohibition that is developed in the same way as distilled spirit was in America, which was the main killer drug. And that if we end prohibition and have a legal market, people get to use the cannabis of their choice, and not necessarily one that the illegal market wants to take.
Well, I don't necessarily accept the view that stronger forms of cannabis or different forms of cannabis are developed as a result of prohibition. If we look in, for example, Holland, and we see different varieties of cannabis available in Amsterdam, in various coffee shops or cannabis coffee shops that are available there, and there is an opportunity for people to decide what potency and what strength that they use. So I don't necessarily accept that prohibition has driven a market towards creating stronger varieties and stronger types of cannabis. But what we do know is that stronger types of cannabis and skunk has a stronger correlation with psychosis and some of the harmful mental health effects that we know are linked with the use of cannabis and the chemicals which it contains. Now, on that subject, Mr. Evans, there are about 400 chemicals in an average cannabis plant. The four main compounds are called delta-9 THC, cannabidiol, delta-8 tetrahydrocannabinol, and cannabinol. Apart from CBD, which is the cannabidiol, these compounds are psychoactive, the strongest one being delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, and the stronger varieties of the plant contain little CBD, whilst the delta-9 THC content is a lot higher. So we are talking about a number of substances here that are psychoactive, and the stronger plants, the stronger varieties tend to have and contain larger amounts of the more psychoactive components and more psychoactive compounds. So when cannabis is smoked, its compounds rapidly enter the bloodstream and are transported directly to the brain and other parts of the body. The feeling of being stoned or high, and not an experience I have had either in common with my right honourable friend, is caused mainly by the delta-9 THC binding to a cannabinoid receptor in the brain. And most of these receptors are found in parts of the brain that influence emotion, pleasure, memory, thought, concentration, sensory and time perception. And cannabis compounds can also affect the eyes, ears, skin and the stomach. We know that there are a number of effects, some of which people describe as pleasurable, some of which we know are harmful. But I wanted to touch on the mental health problems associated with cannabis use in some detail, and some of what I'm about to say is quoted directly from the Royal College of Psychiatrists' information on this. There's growing evidence that people with serious mental illness, including depression and psychosis, are more likely to use cannabis or have used it for long periods of time in the past. Regular use of the drug has appeared to double the risk of developing a psychotic episode or long-term schizophrenia. However, cannabis does cause depression and schizophrenia, but there's also a discussion, and a quite legitimate one, about reverse causality. Is it the fact that people who have schizophrenia and cannabis actually use cannabis as a medication? But in answer to that, we've seen that over the last few years, research has much more strongly suggested that there's a clear link between early cannabis use and later mental health problems in those with a genetic vulnerability, which is a point that my right honourable friend made in his earlier remarks. And there is a particular issue with the use of cannabis by younger people and adolescents. In depression, a study following 1,600 Australian school children aged 14 to 55 for 7 years found that while children who use cannabis regularly had a significantly higher risk of depression, the opposite was not the case. Children who already suffer from depression were not more likely than anyone else to use cannabis. However, adolescents who use cannabis daily were 5 times more likely to develop depression and anxiety in later life. So I think that to some extent covers, through that study, the issue of reverse causality that I pitched up on earlier. But I want in particular to talk about psychosis, schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. There's now sufficient evidence to show, and this is quoting directly from the Royal College of Psychiatrists, that those who use cannabis, particularly at a younger age, around the age of 15, have a higher than average risk of developing a psychotic illness such as schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. These studies also show that the risk is dose-related. In other words, the more cannabis someone used, the more likely they were to develop a psychotic illness. And a study in Australia recently showed that those who used cannabis could develop the illness about over 2.5 years earlier than those who did not. So why should teenagers be particularly vulnerable to the use of cannabis? It's thought that this has something to do with their brain development. The brain is still developing in the teenage years, up to the age of around about 20, and in fact a massive process of neural pruning is going on. This is rather like streaming a tangled jumble of circuits so they can work more effectively. Any experience or substance that affects this process has the potential to produce long-term psychological effects. It's also known that not everyone who uses cannabis, even at a young age, develops a psychotic illness, which is the point my right honourable friend raised very articulately. The available research shows that those who have a family history of psychotic illness, or those who have certain characteristics such as schizotypical personality, or possibly have certain types of genes, may increase the risk of developing psychotic illness following the regular use of strong cannabis. So there is clearly a link, and an increasingly strong link from the research between psychosis and the use of cannabis, and a particular vulnerability and susceptibility in young people. But I wanted also to touch, Mr. Evans, on physical health problems, because even though the main risk to physical health from cannabis is probably from the tobacco that is often smoked with cannabis, new research has also found that the cannabis plant contains carcinogenic mutagens that can affect people's lungs. So, given that we now have evidence also of potential physical harm from the smoking of cannabis, and we have an approach that this House has taken over the years, I believe rightly in the field of public health, to discourage people from smoking and using other substances which harm their physical health. I believe there's a very strong argument to say that there should be some consistency when there's emerging evidence of the physical harm of smoking cannabis, that we need to be consistent in our approach and discourage people as much as possible from smoking cannabis. And that could be done, as my right honourable friend has said, through legalising cannabis and giving people an open choice about it. But I believe when there is compelling arguments of physical harm, that legalisation of a substance we know to be both damaging to someone's mental health and increasingly to their physical health would be the wrong thing to do. However, I wanted also to touch upon some of the issues that were raised about the medical use of cannabis, which cannabis is widely used. I think it's been touched on in this debate by a number of people who attend pain clinics, who self-administer quite illegally obtained cannabis for symptom relief. And we know that at the moment we have a situation where it is very difficult for medical researchers to research the potential benefits of some of the substances in cannabis to alleviate pain or to be used in palliative care or other legitimate medical settings. And I think it's worth touching upon what was already raised very eloquently by the honourable member opposite about Sativex, which is the drug that is used for the treatment of multiple sclerosis, which currently, as was previously said, remains a Schedule 1 controlled drug, which means that there are no Misuse of Drugs Act or regulation requirements on the pharmacists to keep records, nor on the prescriber to write prescriptions in a form other than that required by the Medicines Act, i.e. a prescription-only medication. The MHRA has also issued the manufacturer of Sativex in the UK with a wholesale dealer's licence and an importation licence for patients with MS. The Home Office has therefore been able to issue licences for such supplies and has done so by a general licence that covers all doctors who apply on behalf of individual MS patients. Dispensing pharmacists are also covered by this licence, which is triggered by an application by the doctor to the Home Office Inspectorate. Supplies can be made directly from the company's domestic stocks. So quite a very challenging framework for the medicinal use of cannabis in this country, and one that I believe needs to be looked at. And a suggestion was made earlier that perhaps we could look at moving cannabis from a Schedule 1 to being a Schedule 2 drug, which would be consistent with opioids and the ability of doctors to prescribe, say, methadone as an alternative to somebody who is currently being treated for dependence on heroin as an alternative. And I think it's something that does merit some some looking at, and I'd be grateful if the Minister may respond on that particular point, and the general point of whether there is anything that we can do when we know there are very strong potential medicinal benefits, as being exhibited in a number of studies in the United States, for the potential use of cannabis in palliative care for pain relief, if there's a potential for us in this country to look at some of those issues going forward, because if we can help patients with pain control, if we can help patients to better manage the symptoms of a terminal or progressive disease or illness, that has to be a good thing, and something that we wouldn't want an adverse consequence or an unintended consequence of the current legal framework to get in the way of doing or achieving. And I'd be grateful for the Minister's response on that issue.